know, I just got back from New Zealand, which in some ways is similar to Ireland. Hear me out. I mean, you might be thinking, what on earth could those two countries have in common? Well, they're about the same size in terms of population. They're both led, in the case of Jacinda Ardern, who just finished as the prime minister down there. And if I'm not mistaken, if I'm pronouncing it right, Leo Varadkar in Ireland, both are globalist World Economic Forum young leaders, and both of them use identical language about misinformation and malinformation. I feel like I'm watching, and then I suppose Trudeau, you could throw him in there. I feel like I'm watching three triplets who are doing this as part of some higher ideological calling. There's no demand in any of the three countries, Canada, Ireland, and New Zealand, for censorship. In fact, I've never heard of any country in history call out for censorship, but I feel like the three leaders I've just mentioned are sort of cut from the same cloth, and that this is their mission to enlighten their country by censoring it. What do you think of my analogy? And did I get the Irish leader's name right?
Yeah, Leo Varadkar, absolutely. You did surprisingly well there. Yeah, I think that it's kind of amazing the uniformity of governments across the Western world at this point, and how all of these unrelated politicians are pushing almost identical policies using almost identical language at the exact same time. I mean, we've done many compilations on Gript. I think you guys probably do similar stuff in Canada and in the United States and other places, where we'll cut together compilations of politicians from different political parties who ostensibly oppose one another, all using the exact same language. Like, for example, during the Ukrainian refugee crisis that's going on in Europe at the minute, we've taken in an absolutely alarming amount of asylum seekers from abroad, from all over the world. Some towns and villages up and down the west coast of Ireland have literally had their populations more than doubled overnight, where the town will have a population of 800 and suddenly there's 1,000 asylum seekers there. You know, it's these kinds of numbers. And when justifying the policy, politicians from across the political spectrum all have said on loop, like a beating drum, we need to abide by our international obligations. You know, it's our international obligations that have required us to take in all of these people and so on. And they all use the exact same word. So I don't know what to make of that or what to infer from that. I think, if anything, it just shows the lack of imagination, if you want to put it in a the most benign terms possible, that they are chronically short on new ideas. That might be the culprit.
Well, I think that is too benign an explanation. It reminds me of when all the leaders around the world on Q started using the phrase "build back better." It was bizarre to see that phrase just emanating from everywhere, as if everyone just got the same central memo. I have a theory that, of course, there are local democracies and local parliaments and congresses, but there is no denying that these masters of the universe do gather together without the same scrutiny and disclosure that they have in their national parliaments, in Davos, at the UN, at other supranational meetings. And there are some dissenters. Trump was the biggest dissenter, but the Jacinda Ardern's, the Leo Varadkar's, the Justin Trudeau's, they hammer it out amongst themselves, and without any opposition, without any disclosure of who's there, who's lobbying, and then they go back to their lowly countries where the peasants don't like it. They don't know what's good for them. I think it's identical how Leo Varadkar has pushed these things in Ireland and Justin Trudeau has in Canada. But listen, all this is just preamble. I want to show some comments by your. This is from the Electoral Commission, if I'm not mistaken, including a member of the Irish Supreme Court. I found this absolutely terrifying. You were asking questions about how their Electoral Commission is now arrogating unto itself the power to censor the debate during an election. Why don't you set this clip up for us? And I want to play a few minutes of it because it's astonishing to me, some of the phrases. Give us 1 minute. Where was this? When was this? Who are these people? And then we'll play the clip.
So yeah, the Electoral Commission was just established in February of this year, and it was set up by the government And it has a load of different functions that are, most of which are mundane. So it'll be things like redrawing new constituency boundaries as the population changes and, getting people on the electoral register. Just kind of run-of-the-mill logistical stuff, nothing too controversial. But one of their functions is also to regulate misinformation and disinformation during election time. And so they will have the legal power, they do have the legal power to, if you post something during a campaign, let's say, when you're running for public office, they can order Twitter, they can order Facebook, they can order any publication they want to take it down and correct the quote-unquote error if that is indeed what they determine it to be. Now, of course, as any sensible person knows, there is no possible way to determine in an objective way what is true and what is false. These kinds of things are inevitably going to end up just being a matter of opinion. And we've seen that so many times over the last couple of years. I mean, COVID is the most prime example of that, where how many times did the establishment say that X was the truth, and then it turns out it was the exact opposite, and things that had been labeled as so-called misinformation turned out to be absolutely correct, like the Wuhan lab leak theory, just to pull one example out of the hat. So this kind of thing is absolutely just waiting to be abused. And I mean, it hasn't been in force yet for an Irish election. We've got a local election coming up next year. So it'll be very interesting to see how it plays out. But that's basically who this group are, and that's their modus operandi going forward.
All right, we're talking to Ben Scallon, and here's the question he put to these high priests of the ultimate truth. Now, by the way, Ben, I know that you believe that there are some objective truths, especially if we were talking about things like mathematics. 2 + 2 is 4. There's no other way around it. But when we're talking about political differences of opinion, that's the reason we have an election, because we don't all agree on what the truth is. The thought that these commissioners would be the arbiters, it's terrifying. Here, enough from me. Let's watch the clip.
Our work is focused on the protection, enhancement of democracy in the broad sense. And the main function, purpose is so that we ensure that people have trust and continue to have trust in the election system, our democratic system generally.
Mr. O'Leary, of course, one of your Electoral Commission's purposes is shutting down alleged disinformation at election time. And in June of this year, you told the media that the scale of disinformation around elections is, quote, enormous. I'm just wondering if you could give an example of disinformation that was spread during an Irish election that materially harmed that election in some way.
Okay, Ben, we're here to talk about the constituency review, but I'll make a brief remark, and we will return to this subject into the future. As you know, if for anyone who heard me speak in June, what I actually said was we spent 20 minutes with a panel of people who gave many, many examples of electoral misinformation and disinformation. And what I actually said was, as you have heard from the panel, the scale of this challenge is enormous. The Commission was established in February, and our job is to look forward. But we can't ignore the fact that there is weighty international evidence that electoral misinformation, disinformation carries on online. In a survey or the research that was done between 2016 and 2021, 53 countries were examined, and in 92% of those cases there was found to be examples of misinformation, disinformation. Ireland wasn't one of those countries, but I think there is no reason to assume that we'll be exempt from this into the future as well. We're really looking forward to getting stuck into this part of our brief, and we will be speaking to you all about our approach to misinformation and disinformation as we get to grips with the subject in the autumn.
Do you have a kind of a specific criteria for how you would determine whether something is true or false? Like if you're presented with a piece of information, how do you distinguish something that's disinformation as opposed to just a difference of opinion, let's say?
Well, they're defined very clearly in the legislation, Ben. So if you go back and have a look at how they are both defined, that's the standard of which the Commission, or me as Chief Executive, will make a determination in that regard.
I should say to those of you who haven't read the very long Electoral Act that we have very extensive powers to a research way to research the general topic of information and the way in which advertising happens around elections. But also we have powers to require the correction or removal of information we believe to be incorrect. And they are very extensive powers, not found, in fact, in that many other European countries. We're all going to have to become philosophers in a sense. We're all going to have to learn how to test truth. And the Commission is going to have to learn, A, what the tools are and how to explain them and how to teach them, really. But we're also going to have to deal with the balance between the right of freedom of expression on the one hand, and on the other hand, the right of persons not to be misinformed. Okay. It will be a difficult exercise, but it's fundamental to the protection of democracy, absolutely fundamental, and it's regarded as such by all international bodies, I think.
Okay, we have Adam.
I don't think I've seen a scarier 3 minutes in my life. So many strange things. It's an enormous problem, Ben. Such an enormous problem, he can't think of one example. There are studies in other countries, of which Ireland was not one. I think the worst part was when your Supreme Court judge there was saying we're all going to have to become philosophers. We have an enormous power to determine the truth. Well, but that's not quite true, because what I think and what you think as philosophers doesn't count. It's just what she thinks. Imagine a government agency saying we have an enormous power and the law sets out how to find the truth. Oh, that's all we had to do. Is write down a law, and then we can all just know the truth, because it's right there in the law, Ben, don't you know? Why are you making trouble, Ben? She says at once that this is a almost unique legislation, then she says everyone's doing it, and we're going to find out all together in this messy way. I find that terrifying. I'm glad that Gript is on the case, that's your media outlet. What about the rest of Ireland? Is this just, oh, okay, that's how it is, or are Irish people standing up?
I'm really confused by the fact that the media has not really even bothered to inquire about some of this stuff. In fact, we have this hate speech bill, which is coming down the tracks. It's not in effect yet. The government is yet to pass it, but it could really go either way at this point. There is a substantial amount of backlash from the general public, and would you believe that one of our biggest newspapers was actually writing submissions to the government, urging them to implement it? They were on the side of the censorship law, which to me, if you're a journalist who speaks and thinks for a living, and that's your job, words are your profession, then you supporting a hate speech law is a bit like a butcher supporting a ban on meat. You're literally shooting yourself in the foot. Even aside from the moral questions that would raise as to, is it right for the government to be regulating what people can say and think? That's all a separate issue. Just from a self-preservation perspective, you would expect the media to be leading the charge against this thing. But at this press event, which just took place, recently, I was the only journalist in the room who asked that question. And I don't think that's because I'm special or I'm Superman. I just think there's a critical dereliction of duty on the part of the press here. I mean, one of the things that the CEO of the organization said was, he goes, oh yeah, well, there was this study done and about 50-something countries were examined during the course of this research, and they found that there was misinformation during their election. Okay, well, first of all, what are the 50 countries? I mean, there's hundreds of countries in the world, so that's not meaningful in and of itself if these are all in parts of the world where democracy is not particularly their strong suit, let's say. And also, what kind of disinformation, what impact did it have? Like, if, every single election in the history of humanity has had somebody talking nonsense and telling lies and making stuff up. That's a part of politics. It's a very unfortunate part of politics, but we expect that from politicians. What I would want to know is, did any of this disinformation actually have a tangible impact on any election? Can you show me an election in the Western world that was won on the basis of lies? I mean, if anything, you could say that, for example, here in Ireland, we have a coalition government of several different political parties. And one of the parties, the leader of this party, said he would under no circumstances go into coalition with this other group. And then he did exactly that as soon as he was elected. He said that literally a couple of weeks before the election. So I'd like to know, does that count as electoral misinformation? I mean, there's probably people who voted for him and his party on the basis of that promise, which didn't even last a few weeks after everybody's votes had been cast. But when I asked the Electoral Commission via email, would something like that count as misinformation? They refused to say, which I think kind of says it all as to what sort of game they're playing here.